Good afternoon, everybody. This is Judy. I'm your Q&A moderator for the day. And before introducing our speaker, I'll just mention a few logistics. If you have questions, he will be answering them at the end of the session. And if you have a technical issue, put it into the chat box and our tech assistant will respond to you. So it's my pleasure to welcome David Firestein today back. He's spoken to OLLI several times, and we're looking forward to having him talk to us about China and framing the dragon. And I am going to turn it over to David.
Well, Judy, thank you so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to be here with UT OLLI Quest. It's a real privilege to be back again. I think Judy and perhaps some others in the audience may know that I'm a repeat offender. When it comes to UT OLLI, I'm a huge fan of this program and all that you do and all that you represent. And I'm really delighted to be a part of this once again. This is kind of a first for me, though, in one regard, and that is I've never taught or led a UT OLLI multi-session course before. And so this is a first in that regard. I've done a good number of one-off talks in the past, but I'm really delighted to be able to do a multi-session course with UT OLLI. And I thank all of you who are involved in this for taking the time to be a part of this. And I really look forward to the interaction and to your questions, your comments, and to our time together over the next 6 weeks. Let me just say a little bit about myself. I won't go on too long. And then we'll get into the topic at hand, which is the first of 6 topics that we'll do in this 6-part series, with each session being 70 minutes. So we're going to have about 7 hours together altogether. And since that's so, let me just give you a little bit of a sense for who I am. Again, my name is David Firestein. I'm currently the president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. The inaugural person in that position. It's a relatively new foundation whose mission is to advance U.S. China relations in ways that reflect the ethos, spirit, and values of President George H.W. Bush. It's a nonpartisan entity, and we don't do anything on a partisan basis, but we are very proud to carry forward the George H.W. Bush approach to the U.S.-China relationship, which I might add was the consensus approach on the part of every U.S. president of both parties since Richard Nixon up until the incumbent president. So when I say GHWB or George H.W. Bush, really I'm talking about kind of the mainstream U.S. approach to China. We are a nonprofit that works to build out the U.S.-China relationship, to solve problems in the relationship, and to bring together the United States and China to try to work through the difficult issues on our bilateral agenda, but just as importantly, to try to make contributions to the world as the number 1 and number 2 largest economies in the world and 2 of the most important and influential countries in the world. And so we have our work cut out for us, obviously, in the current climate, but that's what I'm up to now. Before all of that, initially in my career, I was a U.S. diplomat. I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. I also worked at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. But my main area of specialization was China. And I worked as a Foreign Service officer for 18 years. Then I went into the think tank world and continued to work on China as well as Russia. I should say at one point in my career, I actually had a professional portfolio that included China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And that was an interesting time in my career, to put it mildly. But now, in my present capacity, I'm working exclusively on U.S.-China relations. After the think tank world, I came back to my hometown of Austin. This is where I was born and raised. I'm a product of McCallum High School in Austin. And I came back home to the University of Texas and to the LBJ School to do a double master's. And earlier in my career, but when I came back from the think tank, I came back to establish the China Public Policy Center at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT, and did that for 2 years before I got another offer that I couldn't refuse to join the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China relations. And So it's been an interesting professional journey, but I'm delighted to be back in my hometown of Austin and to be able to address OLLI without the OLLI audiences without having to travel from Washington, D.C. or New York City to do so. Now, what I want to talk about today is, and the course, of course, is about basically U.S. China relations, as I put it, version 2021. Here we are at the outset of the year 2021. It's a transitional moment, and I dare say an exciting and, let's say, eventful moment for our nation. Just even in recent days, all kinds of interesting things are happening. And it is certainly a transitional moment for our nation. It's a transitional moment potentially for the US China relationship. And it is a pivotal moment for the US China relationship. So I think it's a great time to take stock of where the relationship is, where it has been, where it is, and where it's going under the soon to be inaugurated Biden administration. So in this session, what I want to do, and this being the first of 6, is pursuant to the kind of outline that I laid out as we were organizing this course, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the US-China relationship and the evolution of China as a factor in US politics. And I should say at the outset, I'm not a historian per se. I mean, I didn't study history. I'm not credentialed in history, but I think to understand where the relationship has been recently, including during the Trump administration, and where it is now and where we're going, I think it's good at the outset of a 6-session course to really lay out a kind of foundation in terms of where the relationship has come from and how it's evolved, and what some of the themes and narratives have been as we've progressed from one decade to the next. So I want to take about 40 minutes or so in this session to talk about this topic of the history of U.S.-China relations and the history of how China has evolved as a topic in U.S. Politics. Now, by the way, the next sessions we'll talk about sources of mistrust in the relationship. We'll talk about assessing the Trump administration's record on China. We'll talk about China's own strategic ambitions and intentions. We'll also talk about the specific issue of trade, which has been the dominant issue on the U.S.-China agenda for about 3 years now, and has always been important, but it's been certainly the dominant issue in recent years. And then finally, we'll talk about the prospects for U.S.-China relations under the Biden administration. Those will be the things that we talk about over the coming weeks. But for now, let me delve into the topic at hand, and let me also note I want to save enough time toward the end of the session to make sure that audience members have the opportunity to ask questions and to offer comments. I really look forward to that part of that more interactive part of our time together. So without further ado, let me say a few things. One, the U.S.-China relationship goes back a long way. It goes back to the 1700s when the United States was a new nation among nations after Independence Day, 1776. And the United States and China engaged with each other in the late 1700s and the 1800s. I'm not going to delve into all of that here because it's far removed from where we are. But I just want to note at a very general level that the United States-China relationship has existed for a long time. Now, that was long before there was a country called the People's Republic of China. It was long before there was a country called the Republic of China, which was the predecessor on the mainland to the People's Republic of China. And it was during the time of the dynasties, and specifically the Qing dynasty. And so there is a long history to the relationship. It's worth studying and reading about. I won't delve into it here, except to make one basic point as a kind of scene-setting point that I think will color a lot of the rest of our discussion in this session and as we go forward. And that is that the United States overall during the 1700s through the 1800s into the early 1900s was a country that was dealing with China, but it was, from a Chinese perspective, in very broad terms, one of the countries that did less harm to China than many of the other countries that China was dealing with. China was dealing with European powers. China was dealing with Japan. China dealt with Russia in various ways. but particularly the European powers and Japan were countries that engaged in actions in China that the Chinese people saw as extraordinarily adversarial, and they viewed it as a kind of bullying or even a kind of carving up of China into different spheres of influence. And the United States, while the US and China had frictions and tensions at various points along the long history of the relationship, overall, the tenor of the US China relationship was more positive than the relationship China had with other countries. And I think that generated a reservoir of goodwill toward the United States that had its roots in the 1700s and especially the 1800s and the early 1900s. And that reservoir of goodwill, to a certain degree, is still present and is still a part of the picture as we talk about US China relations. Now, absolutely, there are incredible tensions in the relationship, as all of us know, and we'll delve into all of that over the course of these sessions. But that notion that the United States was one of the more benign or even friendlier nations toward China 100 years ago and even 150 years ago, that is a concept that I think remains in the Chinese psyche. And that is something that I think continues to color the relationship in certain ways. So that's the main point that I want to make about kind of, if you will, ancient history in terms of the 1700s, the 1800s, and the early 1900s. Let me say a few words about pre-1949. And of course, 1949 is the date, October 1st, 1949, is the date that the People's Republic of China as a nation was established. That was the date that Mao Zedong stood on the gate at Tiananmen Square, the city gate, and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China. So that's what 1949 means. But prior to getting to 1949, as we get into the 1900s, the early 20th century, the United States was dealing with the Republic of China. And the Republic of China began in 1911 and on the mainland continued until the end of the Chinese Civil War between the communists and the KMT or Kuomintang nationalists. And that civil war ended on the mainland in 1949. At that time, the KMT forces or the nationalist forces fled to Taiwan. That's a separate strand. But from 1911 to 1949, the United States was dealing on the mainland with the Republic of China. And the only thing I would say about that period is that, and there are many things one could say, there are many elements of the history of that relationship, but I think the most important takeaway is that during that period, the United States and China, led by the government of the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, a name that is well known in our country, the United States and China were allies. We were allies in what we refer to as World War II and what the Chinese refer to as the war against Japanese aggression. And for them, the war started in 1937, not in 1941. But the bottom line is, during those years that we were in what we call World War II, we were allies with China in fighting Japan and the Axis powers. So not only is there a history of friendship, and as I noted earlier, a well of popular goodwill sort of in the DNA of the Chinese toward the United States, but indeed our two countries were allies during the largest global conflagration in history. And so that is also part of our history. And there was a very close relationship between the United States and China under the KMT, the Republic of China. But as the Civil War unfolded in China between the nationalists and the communists, of course, ultimately the communists prevailed, took over the country, took over the mainland. And as I noted, Mao Zedong proclaimed on October 1st, 1949 in Beijing at Tiananmen Square, the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Now, I think it's helpful to look at the US-China relationship in terms of periods. And I think one thing that's really interesting about the US-China relationship is that there are very distinct periods that in most cases have very specific events that demarcate the boundary between one period and the next period. And you'll see what I mean as we go along. But starting in 1949, I think we can talk about kind of the first period in U.S. PRC, People's Republic of China relations. And that is a period essentially from 1949 to 1972. It's a 23-year period during which basically the United States and China had virtually no contact with each other. It's a period of isolation from each other. It's a period of China's isolation from the world more generally. And when I say China now I'm referring to the People's Republic of China on the mainland, recognizing that there is still Taiwan, and that Taiwan refers to itself as the Republic of China, and that continues even to this day. But now, as I talk about China, I'm talking about the mainland, and I'm talking about the PRC for purposes of this discussion and this course. And so for 23 years, the two countries really just didn't engage with each other. And there was a little bit of contact here and there on the margins of certain international meetings and so on, including with respect to the issue of the Vietnam War, which came up toward the end of this period. But all in all, there was virtually no contact between the United States and China. And that's the period from 1949 to essentially 1972. Now, this led to a real deficit in mutual understanding, and I think it worked in both directions. The absence of essentially any meaningful contact, virtually any contact, resulted in the United States not understanding at that time contemporary China and the PRC very well. I think it resulted in China as a nation not understanding the United States and our intentions very well. And that isolation from each other and that real gap and rift between the countries had, I think, a very profound impact on the overall dynamics of the relationship. Now, in 1971, as a precursor to 1972 being the kind of point where we go into the next period, then Secretary of State Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State to Richard Nixon, made a secret trip to China to pave the way for a visit by President Nixon to China that would occur in February of 1972. And so that contact was significant. That was the highest level contact that the US and China had had up to that point since 1949. Again, that was in the summer, I believe, of 1971. And then ultimately, President Nixon did make that historic trip. I think many of us remember the iconic images of him stepping down from Air Force One and being greeted, and him being on the Great Wall and meeting with the Chinese leadership, including Mao Zedong and so on. And that happened in February of 1972. And at that point, we can talk about the next period in the US China relationship. And that is the period from 1972, from the Nixon visit, to January 1st, 1979. January 1st, 1979 is the date on which the United States and China normalized diplomatic relations, exchanged ambassadors, opened embassies, and began a formal diplomatic relationship. So from 1972 to 1979 is what I would call the opening or early opening and pre-normalization period in the relationship. And this is a time when the United States and China started to engage more with each other. Obviously, President Nixon visited China, which was a remarkable thing at the time. Nixon being a leading, quote, anti-communist in the United States in terms of the US domestic political context. And yet he went there, had very friendly meetings, many smiles, many photo ops, etc. And it started to change the narrative about China in the United States. And so from 1972 to 1979, you saw increasing levels of engagement. You saw the United States set up its first liaison office. It was not yet called an embassy because, again, normalization only occurred on January 1st, 1979. So we had a liaison office, a precursor to what would become the US Embassy in Beijing. And we started engaging. By the way, the second individual to hold the position of director of that liaison office was a gentleman named George H.W. Bush, who lived in China for about 15 months from 1974 to 1975 in that capacity. And others served before and after, but I think it's notable that someone who went on to become president served for over a year in China, and we'll come back to that. And so all these things started to happen. I think many people know the term ping pong diplomacy. That began during this time where we started seeing more exchanges of people, athletes, students, a few people, relatively small number, but a few Americans started traveling to China in the 1970s, and a small number of Chinese to the United States. And this is when we just started opening up the relationship and starting to get to know each other a little bit again. So on January 1st, 1979, normalization occurred under President Carter and also Deng Xiaoping on the Chinese side. And the United States and China and the People's Republic of China began their formal diplomatic relationship for the first time. And again, that was January 1st, 1979. It was a major achievement of President Carter. And if I may just make a parenthetical note, at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, we created an award called the George H.W. Bush Award for contributions to U.S. China relations, and a specific award for statesmanship in U.S. China relations. And the first person to whom we gave the award for statesmanship was President Jimmy Carter for his extraordinary leadership and vision in normalizing the U.S. PRC relationship back in 1978, 1979. And we wanted to recognize that incredible contribution to our nation's life and to the world, and did so in July of 2019. So normalization happens, and that ushers in what I refer to as the honeymoon period in the U.S.-China relationship. This is a period from January 1st, 1979 to June 4th, 1989. We'll come to that in a minute. But during these 10 and a half years, I would say it was really a honeymoon in the relationship. The United States and China generally got along quite well. It was a new relationship. The notion of kind of newlyweds in a bilateral diplomatic sense is probably not a bad metaphor. Things were pretty rosy. There were tough issues in the relationship, but that wasn't the focus at that time. There was a lot of good vibes, a lot of sense of promise that this relationship could blossom and become something very important. And so, generally speaking, that 10 and a half year period was a period of quite good relations between the United States and China. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the underlying geostrategic rationale for, among others, but I think a principal rationale for the rapprochement between the United States and China during this time was that both the United States and China regarded the Soviet Union as a problem, as arguably an adversary, certainly a Cold War adversary. And so the United States and China came together as a strategic matter to counter the influence of the Soviet Union and its bloc. And so there was a lot of camaraderie around those big geostrategic questions. There's the old line in international relations, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And while that may overstate it a little bit, the fact is the United States and China bonded over their similar perceptions of the Soviet Union at that time. And all in all, the relationship went pretty well. That's not to say there weren't difficult issues that still were needed to be addressed periodically, but overall the trajectory was very positive. And probably the most important thing I can say about this period is having visited China first in 1984 and then in 1987, and then been a student at Peking University in 1989, I can tell you firsthand that the sentiments in China in the 1980s toward the United States were off the charts. There was a massive amount of affection for the United States, a massive amount of respect. It would not be much of an exaggeration to say many in China believed that the streets in the United States at that time were paved with gold. It was really kind of a love fest in terms of how the Chinese people saw the United States. I saw that and experienced that firsthand in a good swath of Chinese society when I was visiting and living there. That being said, I think the American people had very positive feelings toward China as well. And you saw that borne out in public opinion numbers, and it was just a very good vibe. And so the relationship started to blossom, started to mature, and engagement between the governments started to fill out, and the contours of the modern U.S.-China relationship started to become clearer. Now, in June 3rd and June 4th of 1989, all of that changed very, very suddenly. I think everyone knows what I'm referring to. In 1989, there was a student movement in China. I was a student at Peking University when that student movement started at Peking University and carried on from April 15th into the early days of June. I personally saw it all unfold. I wrote a book about it at the time and saw what happened, and it was quite a thing to behold. And students and ultimately others took to the streets in Beijing to call for democracy, to call for greater freedoms and greater rights, and so on. And on the night of June 3rd and on the early morning hours of June 4th, the Chinese government opted to forcefully suppress those demonstrators and did so, and resulting in a substantial amount of loss of life, and ultimately forcefully repressed and suppressed this movement and the protesters who were unarmed, and did so, took back Tiananmen Square and exerted or re-exerted central government control over Tiananmen Square, over the city and capital of Beijing, and over the country. And that played out in the early days of June 1989. It's fair to say that there may not be a single day in the U.S.-China relationship that has generated a more dramatic shift and change in the U.S.-China relationship, and certainly in the way that the United States perceives China than June 4th, 1989. And that ushered in a period that I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but basically runs from June 4th, 1989 to approximately mid-1994. I'll explain that timing in a minute. But basically, it ushered in a very, very difficult and I would say icy period in the relationship between the United States and China. The United States reacted very strongly to the events in Beijing in 1989. President George H.W. Bush was the president at that time. He had a very tough job that I think he did tremendously well, which was to give expression to American values around what had happened in China, while not losing sight of America's long-term interests in developing a relationship with China. And I think he tiptoed down that very difficult and fine line remarkably deftly. And it was a major challenge and one that he had to deal with as president. So from 1989 to the end of the early 90s, the relationship changed markedly. Engagement basically evaporated for a number of years. Very little government-to-government contact occurred that was significant. I'll come back to that point in a minute when I talk about presidential visits. Students, in the case of U.S. students traveling to China, the numbers dropped off, understandably, in the wake of the the use of force to suppress these peaceful demonstrators. And by virtually every metric, including, I think, trade numbers, travel numbers, and so on, the relationship really took a hit. Public opinion in the United States really changed toward China in a dramatic way. Basically, I think you saw probably about a 25% drop, 25% drop in favorables toward China overnight. And what had been generally positive feelings about China registered in US public opinion polling in the 1980s came down into and ultimately settled in the sort of 40s, so that you'd have maybe a high of 40 some percent, or over the years, occasionally 50+% viewing China favorably, but a comparable number viewing China unfavorably. A number of policies were put in place in the wake of 1989 that changed the relationship, certainly from a US-China relation standpoint and a US standpoint or US perspective on China. There are still today sanctions in place that are referred to as Tiananmen era sanctions that govern US policy and what we can do or cannot do with China subsequent to the events of 1989. Those policies are in place today, 32 years later. And so the impact and the reverberations of what happened in 1989 are still with us today. So all of those are things that happened. I want to make one point that I alluded to, and that is after the events of June 4th, 1989, the presidents of the United States and China never met again for 8 years. 8 years. So the presidents of our two countries, two vitally important players in the world, the one superpower of the world, the United States, and a rising power in terms of China, now the second largest economy. At that time, it wasn't yet, but it was moving in that direction. The two presidents of these countries didn't meet for a period of 8 years after Tiananmen. That is just, when you think about it, absolutely unfathomable. And yet, that is what happened. That is the degree to which that event shocked and really shook to the core the US China relationship. Now, this period, as I mentioned earlier, I think there are different ways to define it. Certainly 1989, June 4th, 1989 is one point. I would say that by 1994, this period kind of comes to an end and we move into a distinct period in the development of US China relations. The reason I say 1994 is that when Bill Clinton was president, and he came into office in January of 1993 after the 1992 election, he was highly critical of China as a candidate for president. And as president, he initiated a policy posture in which the United States would not grant China most favored nations trading status and basically trade benefits, certain benefits in terms of trading with the United States, in the absence of progress on human rights. So there was a quid pro quo built into US policy by President Clinton and his administration at that time. In 1994, having seen no progress essentially on the matter of human rights, the Clinton administration reversed itself. I was a US diplomat in Beijing at the US Embassy in Beijing at the time that this happened, and I remember it well. The president came out and publicly spoke and stated, "We are going to move to a different policy. This policy hasn't worked, and now we are going to reverse course." And at that point, and the term at the time was to delink. The United States delinked trade from human rights. And I think it's fair, therefore, to say that from 1989 to 1994 is this really difficult, icy period in the US China relationship. But with the delinking of trade and human rights that was initiated by President Clinton in a reversal of his own policy in 1994, I think we can say that we then entered a different period, a qualitatively different period in the relationship. And that brings us to the period of 1994 to 2001. And in broad terms, what I would say about this period is that it is a period in which the emphasis went from being on human rights, which it absolutely was from a US perspective from 1989, June 1989 to 1994. And now the emphasis, and I saw this personally as a diplomat at the US Embassy in Beijing, now the emphasis was on trade, economics, and investment, and basically commercial issues. So 1994 to 2001 is the period where we started to see the US-China commercial relationship and trade relationship in its modern form start to take form. And it was during this time that the United States and China had major bilateral engagements around intellectual property rights, around market access issues, and a host of other trade and investment issues, and also in which the United States and China were engaging in discussions about the possible Chinese accession to the World Trade Organization, or WTO. And it was in this period of time that the negotiations for China's accession into the WTO were occurring, and the United States was a major player, not the only player, but a decisive player in that process. So this was a period where the emphasis on human rights was subsided quite a bit, and the emphasis on economics and trade and China's WTO accession became the central issue in the relationship. And this took us up to 2001. In 2001, we enter a different period, a short period that I refer to, and these are all just sort of my groupings of dates. This is not something you necessarily would see in a standard textbook. You might or you might not, but this is my interpretation of the history of US-China relations. So these are my characterizations. But from 2001 to the spring of 2003, there was a distinct period in U.S. China relations that was quite a bit more positive than the previous periods. And there were two things at work. Number one, in 2001, China became a member of the World Trade Organization. It became a member of the WTO. And that really ushered in the moment. And this was under President George W. Bush, but the negotiations had also occurred under President Clinton. Bipartisan support for these ideas all across the United States official Washington. And as a result, China became a major trading player in the world trading system for the first time ever, and certainly in an official and meaningful way. So that was the first thing that happened in 2001. And that ushered in a new period in the way that the United States and China related to each other as trading partners. The second thing, of course, that happened in 2001 were the attacks of 9/11. And on September the 11th, 2001, the United States suffered a devastating terrorist attack perpetrated by Al Qaeda. And we lost over 3,000 people on that day. And immediately thereafter, whatever else was on the national agenda obviously took a huge backseat to the issue of 9/11 and the issue of dealing with the perpetrators of 9/11 and fighting terrorism. And the United States and China at that point entered into a very close, I would say almost an unprecedentedly close relationship around the issue of the scourge of terrorism globally. Obviously, we had been struck, but all nations, virtually all nations, came together in the aftermath of 9/11, including Russia, by the way, at that time, and many, many others, came together and said, this cannot stand. We stand with the United States. And China was among the first to express that solidarity with our nation in the wake of that devastating strike against our nation. As a result, the United States and China, for about a year and a half, for almost 2 years, had a very close relationship around counterterrorism issues. We exchanged intelligence, shared intelligence. We strategized together about issues in terms of how to approach terrorism in the United Nations and how to approach terrorism globally. And the United States and China did things during that period that we had never done before because of the unprecedented set of events that had led us to that point. So there was a period from the 9/11 attacks not long after China's accession into the WTO to 2003, where there was a very positive tonality and substance in the relationship. 2003 ushers in a new period that goes to 2010. And the reason 2003 is a significant date is it's in year in all of this is that it is the year that the United States went into Iraq as a part of the overall Bush administration, George W. Bush administration effort to, if you will, take the fight overseas in various ways. And we went into Iraq as a nation in 2003. At that point, China didn't buy into that particular action. It had no problem with the United States going into Afghanistan and going after the Taliban and going after Al Qaeda. But it had a problem with the notion of the United States going into Iraq. By the way, many, many Americans had a problem with that as well, as we all know. And it was a source of major debate in the United States. But in addition to China, Russia, but perhaps even more to the point, even close NATO allies such as France and Germany voted against these actions when these matters came to votes in the United Nations and did not lend their support to these kinds of military moves on the part of the United States. And that represented, I think, the beginning of the end of that really close collaboration that we saw from 2001 to 2003. Iraq and the United States invasion of Iraq changed the equation quite a bit in the mind of China, and for that matter, in the mind of many other nations as well. So from 2003 to 2010, we have the beginning of what I think is the modern, the contemporary contours of the U.S. China relationship. Things started to really change in 2003, going into the 2010 period. China started to be seen as a major, really major and rising economic power in a way that it had not been quite viewed in the same terms in the 1990s. It is now a WTO member. It is trading. It is growing. It's growing rapidly at over 10% annualized a year. There starts to be a perception in the United States that China is, quote, taking our jobs or stealing our jobs. There starts to be a perception in the United States that manufacturing jobs are flowing not only to Mexico in the wake of NAFTA, but also to China. This is a theme that starts coming up and that starts becoming resonant politically in the United States. And you have much more of a sense that China is becoming a strong and formidable competitor to the United States, certainly economically. And so this shift played out over those years, which was basically the remainder of the George W. Bush administration and into the first year or so of the Obama administration. And that's where we started to see a shift from thinking of China as a country that we'd like to see fully engaged in the trading system and the global trading regime, to a country that, now that they are engaging in in trade in that way, is all of a sudden quite a formidable competitor. And we see evidence of this shift in the U.S. mindset and the U.S. narrative during this period. Now here, we're now kind of within the last decade, and I'll wrap up here very shortly. But this all sets the scene for the other classes that we're going to have over the coming weeks. The 2010 to 2017 period is, I think, a really remarkable period in the history of the U.S. China relationship. It is the time when we started to see the crystallization in the United States, both in the political establishment, but also to a certain degree among average Americans, that China is becoming, and this is my term, but I think it encapsulates well the sentiment, China is becoming a potentially existential competitive threat to the United States of America. That it is not just some country that's on the other side of the world, but it is a country that is now starting to have a bearing on average Americans as they sit in their homes and as they sit at their kitchen tables, and that it's a country that is now affecting many aspects of American life, and by the way, affecting, to under this narrative, in a negative way, many aspects of American life. Here, I want to just mention four brief vignettes before kind of concluding with the present, the 2017 to 2021 period, and then concluding and opening it up for your questions and comments. But I want to give you four vignettes that are quite interesting and revelatory, telling about how the United States psyche and mindset about China started to shift during this 2010 to 2017 period. And so there's four examples I want to mention, and they're in chronological order. Two pertain to Democrats and two pertain to Republicans. And my point being, the phenomena that I'm describing here was a bipartisan phenomenon. It was not something that was just a Republican mindset or a Democratic mindset or approach. It's something that we saw seep into the establishment on both sides of the aisle. So very quickly, in 2010, the Philadelphia Eagles were going to host the Minnesota Vikings in Philadelphia for a Monday night football game. Governor Ed Rendell was the governor of Pennsylvania at that time. The game got blizzarded out. There was a huge blizzard in Philadelphia, a historic blizzard. For the first time that I ever saw in my life prior to COVID, an NFL game was not held at the appointed time. It was postponed because of the weather. I'd never seen that, and it happened. And Ed Rendell, the governor of Pennsylvania, said in response to that the following words. He said, "If this were China, there would be armies of volunteers clearing the streets of snow, and with one hand on the shovel and the other hand holding a calculus book, learning calculus at the same time." That's what Rendell said the Chinese would do if this were taking place in China. And then he said, and these are his exact words, he said, quote, "We have become a nation of wusses. We have become a nation of wusses." Those were the words of Governor Rendell. So the Philadelphia Eagles are hosting the Minnesota Vikings, and the governor of the state of Pennsylvania sees a China connection, meaning he thinks of China when he thinks of how we handled that situation. I was the first person to point out the shift that represented in the U.S. framing of China in our politics, in speeches that I gave back in 2010 and 2011 and 2012. But that was a signal and a seminal moment in the history of the evolution of the U.S. China, the U.S. narrative about China. The notion that China could kick our backsides and that it would do things better, it would succeed, it would prevail. Where we canceled the game, they wouldn't cancel the game. That's where you started to see a shift in how we talked about China in this country. The second example is something that I was also the first to note, and I wrote a piece about this, an op-ed about this at the time. The President Obama in 2011 gave his annual presidential State of the Union address. Typically, when U.S. presidents give the State of the Union address on Capitol Hill, they divide the address into two sections: domestic policy and foreign policy. And President Obama did that as well. But what was remarkable about his speech was that all of his mentions of China were in the domestic policy section of his speech. And in the foreign policy portion of his 70 or 75-minute speech, there was not a single mention of China. And so the notion of China ceasing to be a foreign policy issue and becoming effectively a domestic policy issue viewed through the prism of education, labor, jobs, manufacturing, science, research and development, all environmental issues. This was the framing of China that took hold during this period. And this was President Obama in the State of the Union. The third data point is also remarkable. In 2012, early 2012, the Republican candidates for president were running in the primaries and engaging in debates. There were about 24 GOP debates in the primaries. I watched all of them. I'm a political junkie. I watch all the debates on both sides of the aisle every year. And I watched all of them. About six of those debates were billed as foreign policy debates. The other 18 were all things or mostly domestic policy. In the 6 foreign policy debates, there was a remarkable thing that I observed. China was not mentioned in any of the debates. China was not mentioned in any of the foreign policy debates of the GOP contenders in the year 2012. But it was mentioned in the other 18 debates in the context of domestic policy. Here again, a Republican side of the aisle example of the same thing that I just spoke about when I talked about President Obama's State of the Union address. Our framing of China ceased to be thinking of China as a foreign policy matter and started to become, hey, China is getting under our skin in ways that hit very close to home and that affect families at their kitchen tables. And now it's being framed as a domestic policy matter. The final point I would make is Romney, who became the nominee of the Republican Party, and I'll stop here shortly. Romney, who became the nominee of the Republican Party, made a remarkable comment as the GOP nominee for president in 2012. He said, and I'm paraphrasing closely, he said, if I become president, when I'm elected president, I will look at the U.S. federal budget of $3 to $4 trillion, $3 to $4 trillion federal budget. And with respect to every dollar of that budget, I will ask myself this question: is this expenditure worth borrowing money from China in order to fund? In other words, does this expenditure merit borrowing from China? And if it does, then we'll do it. And if it doesn't, then we won't do it. But Romney, as a major party presidential candidate, stated that he would apply essentially a China test to every dollar of federal spending, something that no presidential candidate had ever said in history. Now, that's spending on agriculture, that's spending on Social Security, that's spending on every domestic program you can think of. And China is in the mind of this presidential candidate in terms of assessing whether to spend that US federal government dollar. That is another signal, circa 2012 now, of how the shift that occurred in the US approach to thinking about and talking about China. In short, China went from being over there to being right here. And psychically, it became a clear and present part of our lives, and arguably in the minds of some, a clear and present, let's say, and a formidable competitor to the United States that potentially had the capacity to change our way of life. And that's what happened in the 2010 to 2017 period. As I transition to the last point I want to make about 2017 to 2021, which is coterminous with the term of President Trump as president, note that this was playing out 2010 to 2017, including in 2015, when Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency of the United States, and recognized that China was probably one of the 3 or 4 single most important themes of the Trump campaign and of Trump's all of his public comments and his stump speech through that basically a 1.5 year long campaign for president. China was not the only issue, but was one of the major issues. And it was against the backdrop of this changing narrative in the United States about the threat that China, the competitive threat that China presented. President Trump won and became president and took office in January of 2017. And that ushers in the last period, which is also a very distinct period, that of 2017 to the present date, 2021. And during this time, to put it simply, and I'll conclude here shortly, bottom line is that many in Washington, in the White House, including seemingly at times President Trump, and sometimes it didn't seem this way, but sometimes it did, it's people around him, allies in Congress, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, a significant swath of official Washington came to start speaking about China as the enemy of our nation, the enemy of our nation during this period of 2017 to 2021 to the present moment. And so whereas in 2010 to 2017, the notion that China was a formidable competitor was the idea that started to crystallize. But starting with the presidency of Donald Trump, we now see that there is a significant swath of official Washington that has publicly stated effectively that China is the enemy of our nation. Well, that is a reframing of China. That is a historically different mindset. And it's one that is not only in official Washington, but that has started to seep into the American public. Historically, a relatively small number of Americans have tended to regard China as, quote, an enemy, when companies like Pew and Gallup and others have done polling on this topic. And there's extensive polling going back several decades on US sentiments toward China. But in recent years, we've seen more than a doubling of the number of Americans, average Americans, to say nothing of Washington, who have said that they regard China as the enemy of our nation. We now are at, according to Pew, the Pew Research Center, we now are at about 26% of Americans who state that they regard China as the enemy of our nation. Now that means that 74%, according to that poll, don't regard China in that way, but 26% is a high water mark in the modern era of US China relations. And it's a reflection of the way that the discourse about China has unfolded over the last several years. So we are now at a point when we're summarizing the 4 years of 2017 to 2021, and just using one phrase to summarize the US mindset or narrative about China, we are now at China is the enemy. And it begs the question, where do we go from here? We'll talk about that in our upcoming sessions. And I'll talk about what my assessment of where I think we'll see changes and also continuity. But that's what I want to share with you as to the road that we've traveled in this relationship. It has been an evolution over a period of time. There have been specific reasons why things have evolved in these ways. But we are now at a point in the US-China relationship where, and I'll conclude with this, we're in a deeply strained relationship, a troubled relationship, a relationship that is at a pivotal moment, and one that could go a number of different directions over the coming weeks, months, and years. But I think that this backdrop of where things have come from will help contextualize where things are and where they may go as we discuss those issues in the remaining sessions of this course. And with that, I want to thank all of you all for listening to my long-winded presentation. And I will stop here and, as promised, leave some time for your questions and your comments. And I look forward to those. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for once again broadening our knowledge about China and our perspective. So we have several questions, and I would just mention to everybody, you can continue to put questions in as David addresses them. We'll start with the first one from Terry Tottenham. He asks, how does the China leadership view the events of January 6th?
It's a great question. In short, there are a lot of things that I could say, but to this specific question, I believe that the Chinese leadership looks at the events of January 6th and feels vindicated in their choice of how they govern their country. They have always had, the leadership of China has always taken a different view about democracy as we define it than we do, and than many in the world do. They believe, they meaning the leadership of China, believes that China's system is right for China, and that a US style or Jeffersonian style of democracy would not serve China well. There may well be many Americans who disagree with that assessment, but I think it's fair to say that is the assessment China has made and the leadership of China has made. And I think that what they saw was chaos, confusion, obviously, essentially an insurrection in which you had some people armed with either sticks or in some cases perhaps weapons, guns, different types of tear gas and so on, fighting police forces on the steps of our capital. That is something China would never want to see happen in its country, in their country. And they look at not only the events of January 6th, but all that has happened since the election, since it became clear that Joseph Biden won the presidential election, which became clear 2 or 3 days after the election itself. Everything that has happened since then, in the 2 months since that time, the Chinese look at as evidence of exactly why democracy is not the right system for them. And I think they feel a sense of vindication in the choices that they have made. I have to say also on a related note that, and I, I'm not partisan in my comments. I don't advocate for the election or defeat of any candidate at any level. And I have voted for candidates of both political parties at all levels of government. But so what I'm saying now is not partisan, but I think any objective observer would agree that it's factually true. And that is that we have never seen a sledgehammer taken to the image and reputation of American democracy like what we've seen over the last 4 years, and in particular over the last several months. Our reputation as a beacon of light unto the world, as a shining city, to use Reagan's phrase, as the kind of paragon of democratic virtue, has been shattered. It's been shattered by the incumbent president of the United States more than any other individual in American history. And this is how the Chinese see it. They look at our system and they say, your system produced him. And they feel vindicated in the choices that they've made, because they would never want their system to produce someone like our system produced over the last 4 years. And that's how they see it. And you'll occasionally hear people, just one final point on this, you'll occasionally hear people say, express sadness. I'm talking about members of the Chinese public, Chinese officials, genuine sadness to have seen what they have seen and what all of us have seen transpire in our country in recent days, weeks, and months, and frankly, years. And genuinely, there are some that are sad for America that we've gone through this. There are others who are hardliners who basically take a different view, which is, well, maybe this will take you down a peg or two, and maybe you won't be so high and haughty and sit in judgment of everyone else in the world when look at the mess you've got in your own country. And there is that strain of kind of nationalistic thinking as well. But I think the leadership, back to the question, looks at this and says, this is exactly why we don't have U.S. democracy in the People's Republic of China. And this is why we don't want it. So that's the reaction that I hear.
Thanks, David. And Dave S. has a question. Is the relatively benign history of U.S. China relations in the 1800s known by people in China today?
It is. It's a great question. And the short answer is it is. Chinese history books have a particular take on a lot of historical issues. Of course, any nation's history books do, but certainly China has its take, and how they characterize things like the Korean War is very different than what we learn. How they characterize that so-called century of humiliation from the mid 1800s to the mid 1900s and the founding and the establishment of the People's Republic of China is very very, they have a very particular take on that. In the officially sanctioned histories of this period of time, the United States is not treated in the same negative tonality and with the same negative tonality that a lot of the other colonial powers, colonial relative to China, were treated. And so it is inculcated in the Chinese people um, in terms of their study of history and their knowledge and what they see on TV and in the mass media and movies and so on, a huge percentage of which are historically themed. It is kind of conditioned within the Chinese population to recognize that the United States was a relatively benign foreign interlocutor to China at a time when other nations were not so benign, and were much more malicious, and did much more damage to the Chinese state, the Chinese economy, and Chinese society. In addition, it is well known among the Chinese population that the United States helped build some of the great institutions philanthropically in China, including Tsinghua University and major hospitals and so on. And those acts of friendship and philanthropic generosity on behalf of the American people, sometimes in the case of U.S. government expenditures, sometimes in the case of private philanthropic donations, those generous actions are known to the people of China. They are discussed in conversation by the people of China. I've seen it over 30 plus years, and they're appreciated even to this day. And while there is sentiments in China today are not what they were in the 1980s or even 10 or 15 years ago, nevertheless, the Chinese people have not forgotten these positive elements of the history of the U.S. China relationship.
David, Dave S. had one other question, and you just mentioned Korea, so I'll ask his question. And he said you didn't mention the Korean War.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Korean War obviously was a very significant geopolitical event. It occurred during that period where, and just to be clear, where the United States and China really didn't have diplomatic engagement, but needless to say, of course, the United States and China fought both through Korean proxies and ultimately directly across the battlefield from each other in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula in the 1950 to 1953 period. Absolutely, that is true. And so yes, there was a huge amount of enmity. We were fighting with each other. We were on opposite sides of a hot war. But the point that I was making in terms of the bilateral diplomatic relationship was that we were not engaging with each other bilaterally in terms of diplomatic relations. Yes, of course, we were engaging across the field of battle, and that too colored a lot of what happened over the next 15 or 20 years. And that's certainly a very good point to make.
Thanks, David. Louise Daffron asks, can you explain more on why Clinton abandoned rejection of the China human rights policies? What was his rationale and motivation?
Yes, it's a very good question. And to put it simply, again, the policy that President Clinton put in place was the idea of linkage, linking U.S. Treatment of China as a trading partner to China, to improvement of Chinese human rights practices. The reason the policy was reversed or discarded, if you will, was because the administration recognized that two things. Number one, the ability of the United States to induce China to do something fundamentally differently in terms of human rights ultimately is extremely limited to nil. And that we weren't going to be able to simply impose our will on China and make them do this or make them do that or make them, have Jeffersonian style democracy the next day and so on. And I think once President Clinton and his team realized that, and frankly realized that it was futile, they also realized something else, that not engaging with China from a trade standpoint and not opening up the trade relationship was counterproductive relative to the United States itself. And so that they came to the judgment, which I think was the correct judgment at the time, whether one liked it or not, whether one was delighted about the outcome or not. I think analytically, clinically, it was the correct decision that we're not going to make a difference on human rights. Therefore, let us at least make a difference in terms of trade and get something rather than nothing. Secondly, the underlying assumption at that time in the Clinton administration and in the US government was that by engaging China on trade and opening China up as a trading partner, and having more companies of the United States come into China and succeed, and having quote unquote Coca-Cola and McDonald's and so forth and so on become a part of Chinese life, that in a broad sense that this could encourage the liberalization of China in itself, and therefore engaging, or what was termed at the time constructive engagement with China, made sense, and that there was more than one way to skin the cat. We couldn't simply dictate to the Chinese what to do any more than they can dictate to us what to do. And once that realization occurred, the other realization that, well, maybe we can get China to move in a direction we would like to see them move in if we engage economically and generate greater levels of liberalism and pluralism through economic engagement. And for those reasons, the Clinton administration ultimately decided to drop the quid pro quo, the linkage, and to reverse course and pursue that approach, which became a bipartisan approach with the support of both Democrats and Republicans and successive Republican and Democratic presidents later on.
Thanks, David. Linda Davis asks, wasn't Romney referring to the fact that China was buying huge quantities of our debt at that time in 2012?
Yes, that's exactly right. And just to be specific, over the last decade or more, China has owned approximately $1 trillion. It fluctuates here and there, but it's been on the order of magnitude of about $1 trillion in U.S. Government bonds. So it's a significant fraction of the overall U.S. debt, national debt. And yes, that is exactly what Romney was referring to. But note this: China historically has held about 5% of our debt. I think it's actually less than that now because our debt has absolutely exploded under this administration, and others as well. But particularly, we added about $4 trillion to the debt just this year, so the numbers are skyrocketing. And now China's percentage of the debt is lower than it was, but it hovered around 5%. But what Romney was doing was, yes, referring to that, but in a way that was disingenuous, because he wasn't referring to the other 95% of the folks that hold our debt, including countries like Japan, Saudi Arabia, and various others. He was singling out China in a way that was a kind of rhetorical sleight of hand. He made the point that he wanted to make, but the reality is, the logic of his metaphor doesn't work because China actually holds a very small fraction of the debt that we have. But yes, that's what he was referring to.
David, thank you. I think we have time for one more, so this will be the last question. Anonymous attendee asks, do you think that more Americans and Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders might see China as a bully, whether or not they see China as an enemy?
Yes, I do. I think many in this country, unquestionably, and in Canada and in Australia and New Zealand, all countries that have had issues emerge with China in recent years, in particular, in terms of changing the sentiment. Yes, I think significant swaths of all of the publics of all of these countries do see China as a bully. I think China does throw its weight around in certain ways, including in the South China Sea, including in how it deals with Taiwan, across the Taiwan Strait, and to say nothing of what it does domestically. And so, yes, I think people see that. I think they see some of the hardline language that comes out of some Chinese diplomats. Some of it's quite incendiary. Of course, we have incendiary language in this country too, but yes, they have it as well. And yes, I think a lot of people see China that way. And I think looking objectively at some Chinese actions, it's not an unfair assessment. Some of the things China does are wrong and heavy-handed. As I've said before, I think, for example, China's position on the South China Sea is indefensible, and yet it continues to engage in pretty aggressive actions there. And so there are a lot of people that I think see China, if not as the enemy, and there's some that see China as the enemy, but I think most don't. But of those that don't, I think a lot of those folks do see China as a bully. And I think the thing that my friends in China don't sometimes understand is that um, they don't always take the time to think about what actions China has engaged in that may have given rise to those sentiments. There tends to be a reflexive sense that that is an inaccurate understanding or an incorrect or wrong understanding of China, without being a little bit more self-reflective and self-critical and asking, what is it that we've done that has caused so many people to react this way? But yes, I think there is a strong sense in this country across the partisan aisle and across the others that were mentioned in the question that China is throwing its weight around in a way that is troubling, and in a way that the United States and other countries need to respond to effectively.
David, thank you again for a great session. We have lots of questions, so people will be bringing them back and ready. And we actually had over 200 people in attendance. So
That is wonderful. And Judy, thank you so much, my old friend, and I'm so grateful for you being the moderator of this. I'm thankful to everyone for being a part of this, and I look forward to the next 5 sessions. And I'm just honored to be a part of it. Thank you so much.
we look forward to next week. Take care, y'all.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
all
David.
very much. Appreciate it. Welcome.